Um, Terry has not, um, Terry is traveling. And he was hoping to join us, but I'm not sure if he will or not. So far, he hasn't. Um, but as we mentioned in a message that we sent out, in part because we had cancellation of people who were scheduled for today, we thought we'd take this as an opportunity to just have a kind of open-ended discussion. And what we would suggest that people do is just if you've got something that you want to contribute, you can always use the chat, but if you'd like, you could even we can try it out by just having you unmute yourself, and you can make a comment and ask a question. The other thing that you can do is you can put yourself or put the whole thing in the gallery view, so you can see everybody that's on, rather than the what's the alternative? The
speaker view.
Speaker view. Yeah. Thank you. So that might be another way in which we can have a more robust discussion. I did ask people if they had suggestions, and I got a number of suggestions for topics. And what I thought I would do, there were quite a few people, I guess not surprisingly, that suggested that we talk a bit about what's going on in Israel. And so why don't we start out with that, and then we can move on to, well, Kurt's about to go to Guatemala. There's a lot that's been going on there that I haven't followed as much as I'd like to. So I'd like to hear Kurt talk about that. There's the Trump legal issues, the continued race for Speaker of the House of Representatives. There are a number of other kinds of things. The primaries, especially what's going on in Iowa, South Carolina, and New Hampshire right now. Those are the first primaries, and a lot of activity there. So what I'm going to do to start out with the discussion of the Middle East is I am going to do a share screen. So let me get that up. Here we go. There. Okay. Now, well, I'm not sure. Okay. Okay. There we go. Okay. One way of just beginning the discussion is to remind people of the geography of the area. It's an area where I think most of us are not all that familiar with. So I thought I'd remind people about where things are, because that's really pretty key to what's going on and what's likely to be going on. So this is obviously a map of the Middle East generally. The area that we're really talking about is just small area over here, Israel, and of course it involves Lebanon and Syria, Jordan to some extent. They tried to stay out of it as much as possible. Egypt is involved, and Iran and Saudi Arabia are involved. And just a comment there, you know, Iran and Saudi Arabia are important in this whole panoply of countries, especially when we start focusing on Muslim countries, in that their leaders have for about 4 or 5 decades at least now, they have respectively vied with one another to become not just the leaders of their own country, but leaders of the Muslim world generally. And sets up a very interesting kind of dynamic and explains a lot of situation where Iran, for example, will help out rebels in Syria, and that Iran and Iraq both share a lot of cultural things and religious, but that Iran really is seeking to dominate the situation in Iraq, and vice versa. Saudi Arabia has gotten involved in helping Iraq. So when we think back on when we were much more involved in that kind of conflict, that was important. But Iran and Saudi Arabia are inevitably involved in what's going on in Israel as well. And here is a close-up of Israel, and importantly, shows the location of the Palestinians. The Palestinians have two areas that they are trying to make into a state. A lot of international efforts to make these into a state. One is the Gaza Strip, where a lot of the attention has been recently, but also the West Bank is also Palestinian. And they aren't contiguous. And in both cases, Israel is really, I mean, on the West Bank, they're very involved and much more involved as an occupying force in many ways. But Israel, of course, is very concerned about Gaza. They've told the Palestinians to, you know, that's an area where you ought to go and live and have your economic activities. Same thing with West Bank. Israel is taking care of what they call external security, but inevitably there are conflicts between the Palestinians in both of these areas and Israel. In the West Bank, which is getting more involved in the current conflict than it was originally. Israel has had a number of airstrikes in the West Bank. There's demonstrations in the West Bank and pushback against the Israelis. There are three zones in the West Bank. Zone A, which is around Jerusalem here, about 18% of the territory. Zone B is a little bit larger area, and then Zone C is the largest of the area. There are 2.7 million people in the West Bank, Palestinians, and 700,000 Israelis in the West Bank. And a major issue for the West Bank, which is not the same issue as exists in Gaza, is the Israeli settlements. There's a lot of international unhappiness and pushback against Israel continuing to allow, in some cases, the charges that they're even encouraging Israelis to settle in areas, establish farms and the like, and housing. Sometimes this is a matter of appropriating land that was Palestinian, so there's an obvious conflict there. But the whole issue of the settlers in the West Bank is an ongoing kind of issue. The West Bank is governed differently than Gaza. There's a Palestinian authority that governs in the West Bank. And the Palestinian Authority has actually recognized Israel and accepted at least formally, the existence of Israel. That is a big difference than the situation in Gaza. Gaza is about 25-mile long area. Gaza is an area about 2 times the size of Washington, D.C. The West Bank is about the size of Delaware. And in Gaza, that's where it's much more densely packed. There are 2.3 million people here, so almost as many Palestinians just in the small areas there are in the West Bank. They feel like they're really squeezed. I mean, they've got the sea right here, of course, the Mediterranean. They've got well, why don't I move to the next slide that shows it a little bit better. So here's something that just focuses on the West Bank, the area where, well, there's another slide that I've got that shows the area that the Israelis have told the Palestinians to vacate because they're going to come in and engage in kind of an urban warfare, really, to take out Hamas, which takes people who are in this northern part of the country and or to the territory and push them down to the south, which is already very very densely packed. You've heard about Rafah. That's the crossing from Egypt into Gaza. It is controlled by the Egyptians, although the Israelis have dictated when that crossing is actually going to be open or not. Right now, they're allowing a minimal amount of relief assistance, but basically, Egypt is not keen to have Palestinians all coming into Egypt through Rafah. That would create problems for them, of course, and so the people are getting more densely populated in this part of Gaza. And although the Israelis have said that this is a safe place if they vacate the northern part, they have had quite a few airstrikes in the south as well. So that people are really frustrated. It's sort of like, well, you're telling us to leave here. There's really no room. There's no place for us to go. And when we do get in there, then you start bombing there too. So that's an ongoing kind of thing. I just saw a news release that 700 people were killed last night in air raids and airstrikes here. In Gaza, the ruling authority, the governing authority, is Hamas. It has been labeled by just about everybody in the world as a terrorist organization. It did win an election to set up a government. Now, this was 17 years ago, so it's been a while since there's been an election, but they are the only governing authority, the only government that exists in Gaza. And they have been in part trying to run a country, but they've also, they do not recognize Israel as a legitimate state. They regard it as an enemy. They have made statements that they would like Israel to exist no longer. And as we've heard, particularly recently, Israel has responded by saying, well, we're going to take out Hamas. The October 7th incident where Hamas had strikes is kind of shown here. Hopefully you can see this pretty well. The areas right in here are where there were gun battles, which is not surprising that it would be so close to the borders. So a lot of these were in kibbutzes that exist right along the area here. Then you've got Israeli airstrikes that have been, and this is a bit out of date, about almost a week out of date now. And then this is where there have been rocket fires that have been launched by Hamas. One of the the concerns, especially when we start talking about airstrikes at this point, or rocket fires, is that Israel is engaged in some preemptive airstrikes. And let's see, we can maybe let's kind of, why don't I go back to the back to here. Israel has been engaged in airstrikes against Syria and Lebanon that are preemptive in nature. So it's not just activity in Gaza and Israel itself. And a major target here is Hezbollah. Hezbollah, like Hamas, is an organization that is would like to see Israel exist no longer. They've been very clear about that. And they are much better organized, much better equipped. They're a much more potent force than Hamas, in part because they've been getting a lot of support from Iran. And Iran has trained some of their fighters. It provides them with armaments. This is a larger force and the like. So that's something that is going on in addition to the strikes that are going on within Israel itself. And here's a map that shows what I was mentioning before, and that is, this is the area that Israel has said the Palestinians, if they ought to vacate because they're going to be sending in their troops on the ground. In addition to, and they have also said they're going to be coming in through the sea, and they're going to wipe. The idea is to wipe out Hamas. A lot of questions about exactly what does that mean, because Hamas, while it is a militant terrorist organization, it's also a government. It's also a movement. It's also an ideology. And so to wipe out that, I mean, even if you conceivably could wipe out all the fighters, it's not clear exactly what the objective is. And the United States has expressed, President Biden and Secretary of Defense Austin have made it very clear that they are concerned about this, the preemptive strikes that Israel has been engaged in, about the kind of force that Israel is using, understandably, in terms of responding to the attacks by Hamas, and Hamas continues to send rockets and things like that into Israel. That hasn't stopped. So there's a real concern about the preemptive strikes, in that nobody really wants to see this escalate and expand. And that becomes a real major concern about that people in the area have, that people in the world really have too. This could get, excuse me, Saudi Arabia is likely to get more involved. Iran could get much more involved than it is right now. There's speculation that Iran is really not eager to have an all-out war with Israel. Israel, of course, is not real eager for that kind of development either. But ongoing in all of this is the idea of it spreading and becoming a much more of a regional kind of affair. So why don't I can stop there. I think that gives a bit of a background to help inform our discussion. And let's see, I'll maybe stop sharing. I can always put this back up if questions. What did I just do? Okay. There. So, so questions, comments, wisecracks.
You have a couple in the chat, Dennis.
Oh, okay. Let's see, is this?
Should be right along the bottom. It should be chat is right next to participants.
I don't see it.
No? Okay.
Might have to hover over the bottom of your screen.
Yep.
And then it'll appear.
Yeah, the toolbar disappears, but might be easier for you just to read them if you can find it.
The chat is part of the button that says more, M-O-R-E.
Yeah, that's where I am right now. So if I click on chat there, for some reason or other,
Not seeing them?
no. Do you want to read them?
Sure. I guess there's been a couple of questions. Actually, if people want to unmute, that might be the easiest to have a discussion. But yeah, have there been any serious discussions about how the land will be divided to form Palestinian state in the area?
There have been ongoing discussions. Recently, there's not been as serious a set of discussions about the two-state way of resolving this, which is to have a Palestinian country as well as Israel. There really isn't technically a Palestinian nation. There are these territories, but they are regarded as occupied by Israel. So that's not really a two-state kind of thing. And Israel, you know, it's very involved in a lot of, I mean, in terms of what they can do economically and politically and the like. So in terms of land, that's, I mean, the land issue is a major issue, as I mentioned, in the West Bank, with and a lot of concern about Israel annexing. In fact, they have annexed East Jerusalem, which was in opposition to an agreement that they reached, the Oslo Accords. They're referred to. There had been a kind of an agreement that Jerusalem would stay separate, but Israel nonetheless annexed East Jerusalem. And there's a real concern in the West Bank, as well as internationally, United Nations and the like, that Israel may it may be about to annex areas of the West Bank for itself, especially the areas where the settlers are. That would be a natural thing to do. So land is an issue. It's particularly an issue in the West Bank. In Gaza, the issue there is not enough land, not very much land at all.
Yeah, another question about who's running the refugee camps that are there.
The United Nations.
Yeah.
That's the major. Most of those are United Nations refugee camps. There are a few other not-for-profits, some religious organizations and the like, but the main refugee camps is run by the United Nations.
So how does this resolve, Dennis?
How does this resolve?
Yeah.
Good question.
Let's say you're in charge of this. How does it resolve?
If I'm in charge, you know, it's tough because you sort of have to undo history, and undoing history is a major kind of concern. You know, Israel was established in 1948 after the British had ended their colonial presence in the Middle East. And when the British pulled out, there was a war. A lot of the Arab countries, Jordan was very involved at that point, and a lot of the territory was Jordanian, and a lot of the Palestinians were in what is now Jordan. Still is the case. So there's been a conflict, and there's been resistance against the very existence of Israel right from the start. But on the other hand, there's been an international agreement, in a sense, that Israel should exist and ought to exist. And it's a matter of trying to have them be good neighbors and have the Arabs be good neighbors. When things first started out, they were not as, they settled down, and it was not the kind of conflict and the terrorism and things like that we're seeing today. But it really has deteriorated. And one of the concerns is that Israel is still a very small country. It has a very small army. It is very dependent, particularly on the United States, for military security. So that puts the United States in a very particular kind of position, which on the one hand gives us an opportunity to be peacemakers, but not all parties, Israel or the Arabs, Muslims, are really of a mind to kind of pursue peace. And the current situation now is one of those kind of a real tough one in that I think most people would agree that what Hamas did on October 7th was despicable. It was inhumane. It was just really, there's nothing that you can, I mean, Hamas has been in a difficult situation, but that's not the way that you respond. On the other hand, you get a lot of people who basically are now taking the position that, well, what Israel is doing, and they've done this after other kinds of incidents like the one on October 7th, is they engage in revenge. I mean, they strike back with overwhelming force, just incredible force, and most of it's U.S. Supplied, so that the differences in the number of people killed is just absolutely amazing. Hamas has got these hostages, which it's using or presumably for leverage, but it's not clear leverage for what. There's not an obvious way out. If I were put in charge of this, I would resign. I'd let somebody else do it. I don't know. Yeah, it's a toughie.
Good answer.
When you talk about the US being, wanting Israel there, I mean, don't the Allies and Russia, I mean, mainly the Allies, from what I remember from history class, were responsible for them being there. I mean, after the Holocaust and the treaties of the end of the war and everything, is everybody got together and said, well, we have to pick a spot to establish Israel where all the past pogroms from Poland and Germany and Russia can stop happening. We're going to put them there. And I remember reading about ship blockades and stuff to establish Israel. And isn't that part of why we've got a responsibility to help them be there?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. That is part of the reasoning, so that when the British were getting, in a sense, kicked out of all of their colonies, one by one, and when it got to the Middle East and the British realized that they couldn't continue to be an empire with control over the Middle East, and they were going to pull out, the discussion about what to do with Jewish people who were in diaspora, who had been persecuted, who had been suffering because of the Holocaust and the like, it became, in a sense, an obvious kind of answer, in part because the Israelis had a home in the Middle East where Israel is now too. They plus the Palestinians, and you had historically people of three major religions living side by side together. And the discussions were interesting. I don't know if your history classes got into it, but there were all sorts of locations where that were being considered for where displaced Jewish people could go, and where sometimes where they would be sent, sometimes where they could go to on their own. I remember one place that was considered very seriously was another British colony, when that was Uganda. And they're going to send them into Uganda. That was going to be a Jewish state. Not a great idea, I think. Made more sense to have them where they are now.
Dennis, isn't it true that if the Palestinians would have accepted the UN mandate in 1948, they would have had their state by now? I mean, they rejected the partition plan of the United Nations and declared war. They would have had their state many years ago if they would have accepted the imperfect plan that the United Nations presented, but they did not, nor did the other Arab neighbors. And I think that's part of the nut of the issue there.
Well, that's true, but part of one of the dynamics that was going on there is, and it's not going on today, and that is there isn't a single spokesperson. There's not a unified voice for the Palestinians, for the Arabs, for the Muslims in the area. They are competing with one another, and so you had some who were indeed. They were fine. They had no problem with Israel and coexisting and having a state. And others said, "No way! Yeah, they're coming in here. They're being forced on us. This is our land. This is our home." And it wasn't resolved. So that you're right. I mean, there were some people, some of the Arab leaders, and they were very resistant to the idea of Israel being established in the first place, and they weren't going to accept having their own state, because that would be a way of accepting Israel. And they devoted themselves to not having Israel there in the first place.
I want to say something that's been missed here. Judaism has very strong ties to the land. It suffuses all the religious beliefs and services, and they were in that land. The Jewish people founded Jerusalem long before the birth of Muhammad, before there were any Muslims. So just to say Uganda would be an equally valid place doesn't make sense. There's strong ties to that land. And then second of all, after when Israel was established, many Jews who lived in Arab countries like Iraq, Yemen, Morocco, Iran, Egypt, lost their homes. They were refugees also, and they went and resettled in Israel and helped to build the Israeli state. But whereas the refugees that were Arabs were left in refugee camps wanting to get back to their homes. They didn't, Jordan is a big country that with lots more space than Israel has, but Jordan did not want the Palestinians and made it, they were not able to settle there. So there were, I think, an equal number of Jewish refugees and Arab refugees, and one group are still in refugee camps this many years later, while the others were absorbed into Israeli society. So we have to keep those things in mind. And also, what gets lost is the groups that are trying to work together. There's a series of schools in Israel called Yad V'Yad, which means hand in hand, where they started with kindergartens, they went all the way up through high school. They had in each classroom an Arabic speaking teacher and a Hebrew speaking teacher, and equal numbers of children, and trying to work together to form, a much juster kind of society. And there are summer camps in the United States that bring Arab or Palestinian children and Jewish children together to try and work out differences. And those voices, in fact, the kibbutzim that got attacked in the South were ones that were really working toward peace. And one of those kibbutzim actually had many Palestinian Gazan workers. And when the crossings were closed, they continued to pay those workers so that they would have a living income. But those are the same ones that got, very attacked by Hamas. So it's not all, everyone recognizes it's not all Gazan residents who are Hamas, but that is who is ruling them and conducted these attacks. Okay.
Yep. Good. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing about those schools. I'd never heard about that. Trying to, you mentioned several schools in the area.
Yeah, and it is frustrating to deal with Hamas. It's, as I mentioned briefly before, it's a terrorist organization. It's also a government. It's also, representative of people who would like to live in peace. It's complicated. It's not all. We don't have all of one voice. It would be nice if we indeed could have somebody that we could sit down with and talk to and pursue peace with.
Well, another thing to consider is that in Israel, there are citizens of Israel who are Palestinian and Arabs who are in the government. They have a role in the government. They can vote. They do not serve in the army, I think, but the Israeli health system has many, many Arab doctors. The tech, they're employed and have citizenship rights. Throughout Israeli society, but none of the Arab states have Jewish citizens that are members of those states, could vote or could work, or live in those countries openly. Aside from the settlers are a problem, and the current Israeli government is really quite unpopular, especially now because they didn't defend, and haven't met with the families of victims. But I don't know if there was an election right now, if Netanyahu would be able to continue to govern. But there's been huge demonstrations, so it's not a solidified society right now, or until these attacks.
Dennis, my understanding is that 17 years ago, the U.S. pushed Israel and Egypt to authorize sort of reasonably free and fair elections in Gaza. And both the Egyptians and the Israelis warned the U.S. that Hamas was likely to win. So we're living with the unintended consequences of U.S. policy from 17 years ago to a certain extent.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And the feeling at the time, the defense of that the United States put forth for continuing to let this happen was that once Hamas got in control and had the government, that they would moderate. Well, that didn't happen. Instead, they used it more as a base to continue their kind of ultimate objective of making Israel go away.
Isn't Hamas on the 17th year of their 4-year term?
Yes, this is the 17th year of the 4-year term. Yep. And there's no dynamic within the country that I'm aware of to indeed make that point in a definitive way and say, come on, let's have another election. And it's hard to know, what would happen, especially, right now. You can make an argument. There can be an expectation that the airstrikes by Israel is generating more support for Hamas. That certainly is, by anecdotal evidence, what's seems to be happening among the young people in the West Bank. On the other hand, there's the issue of, if Hamas had not done what it did, Israel would not have it, would not be having these airstrikes. So it's, any election would be appropriate. I don't think it's likely to happen.
I mean, on the contrary, I think that if they had fair elections in the West Bank, Hamas would probably win that too. So possibly,
Yeah,
so,
it is possible. Hamas has not been very strong on the West Bank. But there has been, even before this, there was some evidence that Hamas was generating more support. Well, do we want to talk about something more delightful, like Trump's legal problems? Or
Well, this is Ray Schultz, and I was just going to add one more thing. I think the issue is, needless to say, there are dozens and dozens of issues, but I don't think anybody has ever really, really, really been serious about a two-state solution. And to split the Palestinians into two geographically isolated areas. The world's tried that in different places, in different areas, and it has not been a successful solution to have geographically distant parts of a given state or a given country. I think Israel, for all kinds of very good reasons, if you want to look at it, but have not been real serious about trying to do something about a Palestinian state. I don't think the UN has taken a really serious state in terms of saying, well, let's do something about having a two-state solution. The world went in there feeling guilt, appropriately so. They should be guilty for what was happening earlier, and snatched land from all kinds of people who had been living there for hundreds and hundreds of years and said, this isn't your land anymore. And part of me thinks that the only way we're going to get around this is if the world comes together, snatches a bunch of land again, and is very serious about helping people set up their own democratic structures. And we've got to do it from the people's perspective. We saw what happened when the United States tried to set up democratic structures in Iraq, and that doesn't work because the United States' attitude about democracy is do it like we do it, except that look at our House of Representatives right now, and we don't do it so well. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I think, if Israel is not really, 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 really serious about a two-state solution, nothing's ever going to happen.
Yeah, good point. It's the two-state solution has been out there, but not much has happened to make it happen, to make it really reality.
And that's understandable because the Palestinians want water access. They need that port and everything. So about the only way I think that anything could happen is if Israel succeeded land so that there'd be a strip between Israel and Egypt that belonged to the Palestinians to give them connectivity. But that would mean Israel giving up a lot. And Israel doesn't even really want to acknowledge that the Palestinians of Gaza.
Mm-hmm. Good point.
I thought about really, it might seem like a trivial analogy to all of this, but when when gangs start moving into an area in any American city, and what the theory is that's been happening from gangs moving into Madison from Chicago years ago, and why did they come here, whatever. Well, it's pretty easy. And then I'm liking this to Hamas, is how do you get rid of it? I mean, a family brings, 5 families come, and they each bring one family member who is likely to be in a gang, and each of those family members join up with the other 4 people and from the other 4 families, and they form their little gang. Well, likewise, Hamas, these are people's family members. It's not like they're isolated individuals that don't belong to anybody. And it's not like they walk around with a hat on their head saying, I am Hamas. I don't understand how Israel thinks that. First of all, I don't agree with just obliterating people, but how do they think they're going to eliminate Hamas? So many people talk about it in a detached way, like, yes, let's just get rid of Hamas. Well, you're not getting rid of a piece of paper. You're getting rid of a human being.
Yeah, and some very passionate people too. And again, that you have to be concerned, not that Israel's got a lot of options, but you have to be concerned about the implications of what's going on, the airstrikes and the massive amount of armaments that are being dropped in Gaza, but also the West Bank now. That doesn't make people your friend.
That was
Speaking
a very nice summary, Dennis. Thank you. Thank you for bringing us all up to speed on everything there.
Sure.
Bringing up the area of the expense of fighting, you make a lot more friends with economic structures, developing places for people to work, and helping people grow economically. Or you can spend billions and millions of dollars dropping bombs. I think if we took all of the money that we keep putting into war structures and instead don't turn it over, but turn it into aid to people to actually make their lives better where they're living, you get a lot more friends if you don't drop bombs on them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and unfortunately, and we see this in domestic politics too, that it's a lot easier to prey on people's fears than it is to build on peace movements and get people to work constructively and cooperatively together. You really wish that the various peace efforts that have been made and are being made would be more robust and effective, but the people who want to get to power and stay in power because of fear, they're much more likely to be successful.
I also want to mention that we should remember that most of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, or at least many of them, are people displaced when the Israelis came in. And so both the Israelis and the Palestinians have legitimate claims to the same land. And both groups have been living there a long time. Mm-hmm. And that makes it extremely complicated. And I agree with what Ray just said. I mean, the economic differences in the prosperity and standard of living difference between Gaza and the West Bank and Israel are immense.
There's a very nice summary of, I believe it's referred to on Wikipedia as the history of the Palestinian people or the origins of the Palestinian people, something to that effect. It's a really nice write-up that talks about through the centuries all the different people that have lived in that region of the world. And it's like, it's really hard to claim it's somebody's land. You have to define what time period you're talking about and then go precisely back to that time period. Are you talking 700 years ago, 300 years ago, 200 years ago? There's so much movement and migration of people in and out of the Middle East that it's very, very hard to claim it's any, one group's land. Very, very hard thing to answer. Kind of the situation we have with Ukraine as well, right? It all depends how far you turn the clock back as to what you claim the ownership of the land is, if you will.
Yeah, and these historic arguments are, they only go so far, right? It's sort of like, well, so what difference did it make? What happened right after the Ottoman Empire kind of disintegrated and fragmented? We're dealing with the 21st century now, and the real issues and where people are. And it's interesting, there's some countries, some cultures, particularly I'm thinking of in Africa and Asia, where the whole concept of land is not really germane. I mean, that's that in itself it's a concept that translates. Obviously, there's agricultural implications, but even then, you don't have to necessarily have such an attachment to land. But and this is true in some countries, in some cultures, but not in others. The fact is, land is a key issue, and there is concern about what's happening in the West Bank with the settlers because of it. That's repeating the same dynamic of people taking land and others getting displaced.
And we tend to think of Palestinians as Arabs, but they're not all Arabs. So
Right.
It's complicated.
Yep. And also,
I-
Palestinians are not necessarily Muslim either.
I question the viability of a two-state solution. It never worked in North Korea, South Korea. It never worked in Taiwan, China. It never worked in East Germany, West Germany. To me, it may be a hope that just avoids the ultimate horrible question of what happened in World War II, unconditional surrender. And Japan became a viable entity, and the Marshall Plan made Europe a viable entity again.
But you could argue there are successful at the end of major world wars, for example. There are successful establishments of more fragmented countries that some would claim are a success, like Slovenia and Slovakia and in parts of the Yugoslav area, but then again, they've had wars since then. So I don't know if you could claim success or not in some of these regions. But today, some of those areas are stable. Some of those nations are stable. So I don't know that it's always a failure.
I would agree it's not always a failure, but something needs to be happening to get people to join together eventually. It's the hand-in-hand program sounds like the way to do it to me. You impose a decent government and then get people to realize that that's a better way to live.
Well, and a real challenge is with the two-state solution, dealing with the West Bank and Gaza, is just the geography, right? The separation between those two areas. You've got, approximately, a little over 2 million in each area, and a lot of territory in between.
We had a book that was published a number of years ago called The Audacity of Hope. If you can give people hope, if you can give them an economic hope, then people will be willing to work towards something because it means that there's hope for them. War is a very profitable enterprise for some people. Land is a very profitable enterprise for some people. If the economics of it are to smaller groups of people and not to the masses of the people, you're not going to grow anywhere. So until we really get a handle on the economic conditions and let people have the audacity of hope, it's going to be a tough road to hoe.
There's Martha asked in the chat if we could talk about Trump and the US Congress.
Okay.
Another happy topic.
Yeah, it's a happier topic, successful, people working together. I mean, one issue that we have to keep in mind, and I think there's some misunderstanding of this, is that the rules of the game are established by the Congress at the time, so that it's not set up in the Constitution that the speaker be selected in the way that is being selected and actually not being selected right now. Those are rules that were established in this case by the Republicans who hold the majority in the House. So they could very easily change the rules, and that would go somewhere. The other thing, of course, is that we're dealing with a two-party situation where in other countries there would be more than two parties, which would allow you for much more open, and it would invite more coalition building. I mean, there's in the past in the United States, we have had situations somewhat similar where if something like the current stalemate happened, you would get a group of people on the other side of the aisle who would basically say, okay, I'm going to switch parties so that we now constitute a more moderate majority or a more conservative majority or whatever, instead of no action at all. And in part, it becomes something that plays to the extremism. I mean, what we've got currently is a group of people, about 24, in the House of Representatives, who are really calling the shots, and holding not only the Republican Party hostage, but the Democrats are being held hostage. And then you could also say, well, but the Democrats are at fault because none of them are going to cross over and vote for a speaker that's not a Democrat. And you could get a more moderate, reasonable kind of speaker than we've had in the last few months by having that kind of a crossover. The civil rights law was passed when we had that kind of coalition building between moderate forms and moderate groups in both parties. So that's a possibility. Although it's possibility in terms of the math more than anything else. The other factor here is Trump, and Trump is acting like a boss. He wants to be a party boss. He wants to have people come to him and have him call the shots, not necessarily in terms of policy, but in terms of power. He's he's got enough Republican members of the House that indeed feel like they need to do what he says, so that he is a factor. He clearly doesn't have a majority support even within the Republican Party. If he did, then Jordan would be the House Speaker right now. But he has 37% of the representatives are going to do what he wants. They're loyalists to him, and then you've got others who are, to various extent, willing to be accepting to accept whatever Trump's preferences are, but it doesn't add up to be a majority of even the Republicans, or it's a majority of the Republicans, but not a majority of the members of the House. So it's a matter of math, but it's also a matter of politics and people not being willing to put aside party identity and loyalty to particular factions, so that they would get together. a European parliamentary system, we wouldn't have the kind of stalemate, the kind of situation that we've got now. We'd have coalition building.
Do you think that the Democrats would vote for somebody, though, if it was Emmer? Or I heard that there were 2 representatives who didn't vote against the ratification of the election. Emmer was one of them.
You're right, but it's not clear. Right now, the Democrats are really pretty solid. And they're basically, well, the other possibility is Hakeem Jeffries could become speaker. And all we need is just a handful of Republicans to recognize that would be the better option. Or you could figure out some kind of a bipartisan solution and come to an agreement on division of who has party chairs. Committee chairs, and maybe a solution where you rotate the speakership. Speaker doesn't have to be as powerful as it has been in the past, but is more somebody who presides over the House. So there are a number of different options that would be available right now.
Dennis, how could a Hakeem Jeffries vote come to the floor? How would that happen? Is it even possible? Would Patrick McHenry have to push that through? How would it happen?
Yes, Patrick McHenry would have to recognize somebody who would make the motion. And that's not going to happen, at least not right now. But yeah, you're right. It's from a parliamentary standpoint, somebody's got to make a motion. And to make a motion, you've got to be recognized. And to be recognized, the person who's going to recognize you is the person with the gavel. And right now that's in the hands of a Republican who, at least so far, has not shown any kind of inclination to to move towards some kind of a bipartisan solution.
So even though Hakeem Jeffries could work from a math perspective, there's a political obstacle here as to whether it would even ever come to a vote.
That's right. Yeah. And again, that's a function of the rules of the game.
If that's the case, then how come the Washington Post has been reporting how many people have been voting for Jeffries?
Well, they're reporting the Democrats, the Democratic caucus. And that's the Democrats have met in caucus, and they actually were meeting on this just before we met with Mark Pocan. He was coming from that caucus meeting. And in that caucus meeting, the Democrats said, okay, we're going to hang in here together. We're all going to do this together. And that's what the Washington Post is that's what they are reporting. Something else that could happen, and has happened in the past, is that we're talking about the math with the number of people who are voting. And so you could have a situation where you get some people who strategically would decide that they're going to go for a walk. And as they are walking around the block, the vote would take place, and you would, one way or another, make somebody the Speaker of the House, and then they could get on with business. And one of the things that the Democratic caucus has done is they've said, nobody go home. You got to be here, because if they call a vote, it's the number of people who are voting and the percentage of people voting. There are all sorts of rules like that. I remember working with the legislature at a time when a number of bills were being considered, and the caucus would make decisions. For example, they would say, okay, to commit the caucus to support this particular bill, we'll only count the number of people who are in favor. we aren't going to count the people who are against. And then you have to reach a certain threshold of the people in favor. So you can make the rules up any way you want to. The rules have consequences, as we see. But
it's going to get resolved before the budget, or before the temporary budgets.
I would think, yeah, I would think that they're going that the pressure of the budget resolution, November 17th is the day where that turns into a pumpkin. And I think there's going to be the kind of pressure that something will get resolved. I would think that it's probably going to get resolved within the next few days, actually.
There some talk about making the pro tem speaker a little more, give him a little more power. That is one option, right? I mean, that
is an option, and that was an option that the Republican caucus met on, and they couldn't get support. Their caucus rule in considering that particular option was that a majority of the Republicans had to be in favor of it, and they didn't get a majority, so they're not pursuing that. No, that could come up again, and they could say, okay, we'll just have a temporary speaker, and that person will preside, call the ayes and the nays, and but not engage in appointing committee chairs. I mean, there are all sorts of powers that a speaker has. The one thing that is of concern, of course, and it's a concern more on paper than in reality at this point at hand, is that the succession rules within the federal government are that the speaker is in line right after the vice president. So if something happens to the president and vice president, the speaker becomes president. The other major kind of function in reality that a speaker has is, although not now, is they are the major fundraiser. So you take away the speaker, if the party doesn't have a speaker, it's hard for them to raise the kind of money that they normally would be raising. That's not all bad.
Has this ever happened like this in
No, we haven't had it happen like this at all. And one rule of the game that the Republicans have agreed to, that they're working on as we speak, is that they've got 8 people who said they'd like to be speaker, so they'll have a vote after they each make their pitch. And then if nobody gets more than 50% of the vote, then the person who's had the least amount of support drops out. So it's kind of like ranked voting. So then they vote again, and that continues until they actually get somebody who's got a majority. Now, the problem with that is that that doesn't automatically mean that whoever gets the majority with that particular process, they become the nominee, but they don't become the speaker. The House still has to vote on the speakership. And so if you've got 5 people who are going to hold out and say, no way, I'm not going to have that person become speaker, they can scuttle the whole thing, and everything's going to have done for naught.
You foresee a split of the Republican Party into a third party ever?
Well, certainly things like that have happened in the past. A third party, I mean, we do have third parties, which is the term we use for any party other than the Republicans or Democrats, but they're just not very viable. And the difficulties of a third party getting established are in part they're legalistic. Getting on the ballots in certain states is very, very difficult if you're not a Republican or Democratic Party. And each state has its own rules in that regard. Getting financial support, and just dealing with the dynamics of brand loyalty. You know, there are just a lot of people that they've got loyalty towards their brand, whether that's Republican or Democrat, and they're going to stick with it. And they're not going to think much further than that. And boy, getting past the threshold of brand loyalty to get people to think of other options is a very, very challenging kind of enterprise.
Yeah, there was another attorney that pled guilty to the in Georgia this morning.
Right.
What do you think about that? Where do you think where do you think that trial's actually going to go? How do you think that's going to?
I think that if I were certain with the initials DT, I'd be very concerned because Jenna Ellis is the most recent person, and that means we now have 4 people, 3 attorneys and a bondsman, who have pled guilty to the case in Georgia, which is one of the most serious cases. It's more serious from a governing standpoint than the fraud dealing with Trump Tower and the finances. These people who have flipped on their agreement is that they pay a fine, that they're on probation, and that they cooperate with the prosecution of the people who haven't flipped. And that one of the issues that has been already resolved in that case is whether or not you can make an argument that there's attorney-client privilege, and that attorneys really can't be forced to testify against their client. And the judge has already ruled that that doesn't apply. And indeed, there's this long-standing rule that says you can't, as an attorney, protect yourself from prosecution if you counsel your client to do something illegal. And what we're talking about here are a series of illegal acts that were done in Georgia. That's nobody's questioning whether or not they were legal or illegal. They were illegal. And so since you were telling Trump to do this, have the fake electors, for example, and make claims of fraudulent elections, even when you knew that was illegal, that means that you don't have any kind of immunity. You don't have any protection. So these attorneys, I mean, they're in a situation where they have agreed to testify against the big guy, and they realize that in making that agreement, they've really made themselves available.
Will they get disbarred?
They could. That would be a separate issue. Disbarment comes mainly from the bar associations
In that state, right?
Yeah, and so there is one of the Sidney Powell is one of the attorneys that has pled guilty, and she is, as we speak, being subjected to disbarment in Texas. So the state of Texas is considering that. There have been, as I recall, I'm trying to remember exactly details, but Rudy Giuliani, it has been disbarred. I think in Washington, D.C. for sure. I think maybe in New York. So disbarment is an issue, and disbarment for an attorney means it's your livelihood.
they're very slow to act. I think Giuliani is just suspended. Nothing has happened in Wisconsin with Michael Gableman, although it was obvious he was contemptuous to a judge. And even John Eastman is still not debarred in California. So the way, it's not necessarily the state bar and there's separate organizations which are attached to the Supreme Court, like the Office of Lawyer Regulation, that actually handles the discipline, and the Supreme Court makes the ultimate decision rather than the bar in this state, at least. But they're very slow to act. They act quickly if you don't pay your income taxes or if you get actually convicted of something. But otherwise, they do publish the discipline, though, eventually when the decision's finally made. We have a number of candidates for debarment in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. That actually helps.
Can we assume that they're pleading guilty because it's to their advantage to plead guilty? Because if they didn't and then they were found guilty, then they'd end up in prison? Is that the deal?
Well, the punishment would surely be much more serious than what they've agreed to. I mean, part of the plea bargain was to be on probation, pay a fine, and write a letter of apology. Say, I'm sorry.
I thought it was interesting too that Powell and Cheeseborough were the ones trying to pull their trials ahead because they wanted to, probably they knew they were going to flip and they knew where they were going to try to negotiate something while the getting was good. And so they were smart enough to do that, try to pull it ahead and get something while they could, while their negotiating power was better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It said that Powell, the difference was if she hadn't pled guilty, she was facing felony charges, but by pleading, she pled guilty to misdemeanors.
I don't know if folks know this, but the actual fake elector scheme in its implementation started in Wisconsin with the Wisconsin fake electors and Kenneth Chesebro contacting the Wisconsin party and their attorney here. And it was all the materials were developed for initial use in Wisconsin and then spread throughout the other states.
And isn't it true that the other states have actually acted, whereas Wisconsin is still kind of sitting on it? We haven't really prosecuted the people involved.
Yeah, one of the problems in Wisconsin is the law which was enacted by the gerrymandered legislature that says criminal defendants in Wisconsin can pick to choose their home residence for the trial. So that so you'd have to have a local district attorney prosecute it. However, I might point out that some of those candidates for debarment do reside in Dane County.
Yep. Yeah, I was going to say some of my best friends, but not really though.
So are you telling me that, or telling us that Josh Cowell, the state DA, cannot on his own right take this case? Jim, is that what you're saying? And it has to be done by a local DA, couldn't be done by the state attorney general?
The state attorney general could do it if the DA asked them to do it. I think that's the way it works. But normally it's the district attorney in that county that does all of the criminal prosecuting.
But if
The
all
DA of a local county might ask for somebody to do perhaps say a major murder case or a very high level arson case or something like that. But I mean, it's,
yeah.
But somebody has to ask him.
Well, the alleged crime occurred in Dane County, right? They tried to go to the Capitol with these fake phony electors.
Yeah, that's the problem with the gerrymandered statute that says that the defendant gets to not the place where the crime was committed, but gets to pick his where he resides to be tried.
So
It's an
the
exception to the
electors are
usual
from,
rule.
so the electors are from different counties. So there wouldn't be a way to have one coordinated lawsuit against all of them?
Well, the electors are specifically from different areas. Their electors are selected on the basis of the areas within the state that are for the representatives and statewide for the senators. So that they're in the geographics of the district, House of Representative districts.
Right, but I'm just asking, does that mean that they can't, that there couldn't be one lawsuit then against all of them because they're from different areas?
They could pick to be tried where they reside, according to the statute.
That's just great.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. I mean, I hope there's an imaginative way you could have some sort of conspiracy trial in Dane County or in Milwaukee County. But, or someplace, but I don't.
James, you muted at the end. I don't know if you knew that, but maybe you did. Now you're muted. Yeah.
No, at Chesbro will probably end up having something happen to him if he doesn't testify truthfully. But yeah, he would still be subject, I would think, to some prosecution here if somebody wanted to do it. Because he doesn't reside within the state, even though he's a Wisconsin native, I think from Wisconsin Rapids. He's not a Wisconsin resident. He resides in Puerto Rico.
Dennis, is it worth us doing a kind of a dissection of what happened and how that happened? I have some understanding of it, but it seems like, James, you've got a whole lot clearer.
You mean about the fake electors?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, this is all connected to the Electoral College, so that states have their own rules about who casts the vote for the Electoral College from that particular state. And Nebraska and Maine have unusual laws in that regard. But in Wisconsin, it's that the electors are the ones, they are selected by the respective political parties, Republicans and Democrats. And they are to represent the different electoral components of the state, so that there are specific individuals that then are empowered, once the results of the election are in, to cast the vote for the state of Wisconsin. And there's, again, a little bit of difference between the states in terms of, well, do they have to vote for whoever won the state, the popular vote in the state? There are some states where that's more question, that they could go ahead and cast it for anybody that they're just in the Electoral College. But Wisconsin, they have to vote for the winning candidate. So what happened is that there's obviously the people who have the vote for Wisconsin and the Electoral College last go around are the ones that were selected by the Democratic Party. They're specific individuals. Well, they are the ones who then send their ballot to Washington, D.C., and that's the one that gets counted when the U.S. Senate gets together. what the Republicans did is they got their own candidates. They already had a slate of people that were going to be their electors if the Republican candidate, if Trump had won. And so what they did is they said, okay, you go ahead, and actually printed up some documents to, help with this fake kind of enterprise. You go ahead and you meet and you cast your votes for Trump and send them in. And their rationale was, well, if it was a fraudulent election, we should have our electors there and ready to go and ready to cast the vote for the real candidate, in this case, Trump. And Vice President Pence refused to accept those. And let's see, Ron Johnson was asked to convey the fake votes from Wisconsin, and he didn't do that either. So the fake votes were cast in the sense that the people met and they transferred the votes to Washington, D.C., but they never got counted. But the Wisconsin law is such that if you try and fake something like that, you're violating the law.
Dennis, if we would ever do a session on electoral college, it would be also interesting to look at these states that have adopted these resolutions to cast their electoral votes for the popular winner of their state,
Right.
and whether that could ever really win the day to effectively eliminate the electoral college.
Yeah. No, that's a
go to
good
the
point. We've talked
If
about.
you go to the
Go ahead.
archives, National Archives, the most popular attempt to change the Constitution is to change the electoral college system. And it has never succeeded. All but 2 states is winner take all, as I understand it, of the electoral votes.
Right. Yeah, it's just Nebraska and Maine that do not have winner take all. And it's up to the states. States are in control of whether it's winner take all or not.
May I?
And-
I just got a flash across my screen that Tom Emmer has been selected as the Republican candidate to vote for the speaker.
Okay, well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So now the question is whether or not when the vote is taken on the floor of the House, because that what you just reported is what happened at caucus. Yeah, in the Republican caucus. Now the question is it going to be the same fate as Jordan and the others, where he doesn't get the required number of votes from the House itself?
Dennis, could you explain if there's a tie in the electoral college, what happens as far as how the vote goes to the, it's complicated, I think, as far as each state gets a vote, or how that works?
It goes to the House of Representatives, and each state gets 1 vote. So it's not the House of Representatives as a whole, but each state has to caucus and decide how their vote is going to be cast. And they don't have to. They could vote for anybody. They could vote for you.
Yeah. And California gets 1 vote, and so does Montana.
Right.
Doesn't make a lot of sense.
Doesn't make a lot of sense. Yeah, it was the great compromise to have states in the United States of America. And a lot of that, as you probably know, was driven by the need to have the southern states on board and have them ratify the Constitution.
It actually has happened where there has been ties. Like the election of 1800 was one, I think, for sure, right?
There was a lot of in the early years of the Republic. There were a lot of strange, what we would regard as strange kind of situations. There was a situation where the vice president was the person who got the second largest number of votes, rather than that the vice president ran with the president. So a lot of that stuff has been changed, but yeah, no, it's not always been neat and tidy.
As it is right now.
Here's a little, yeah, here's a little nugget. By amendment to the Constitution, the District of Columbia gets 3 electoral votes, which is also awfully strange.
Right, very strange. Yeah.
One of the
Well, I
things
think-
I took a history
Good.
class last spring with the UW, just because the Vietnam War, and that wasn't history when I took history class. So I
Mhm.
wanted to learn about something more recent. But the UW says the fall is beginning of the US to the Civil War, and then spring is Civil War to present. And I either never learned or was surprised to learn anyway that the House of Representatives, the representatives used to be picked by the party, that people didn't vote for who their representative was. And that quite surprised me.
Yeah, well, and it's only been relatively recently that senators, US senators, are popularly elected. It used to be that the state legislatures determined who the US senators were going to be. Well, I think we've probably solved all the world's problems. And next week, we're going to have a session on artificial intelligence. Kurt Sippel and Terry Shelton will be leading that discussion, and they will do it in person rather than robotically.
Well, it's a broad topic, changing very quickly. Terry volunteered me, so because I've been following it, and my background's tech, so I guess that probably makes some sense. I certainly can come up, I think, with something that's interesting.
Good. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Really important topic.
Well, it's
Okay.
good to shift.
Dennis, I sent an email to you that is from the Wisconsin Examiner about all the different fake electors in the different states. If you want to look at that and see if it's something you want to forward to the group.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, I'd sure like to see that.
All right, I'll forward that on.
One point, I hope that Kirk brings up Isaac Asimov in discussion next week.
Okay, well, have a good week, everybody.
There's one other point that I don't know if it got read, but Stephanie had something in the comments. Dennis, I don't know if you ever got your chat working so that you could see that. But I had asked about refugee camps existing before the current thing, and Stephanie says that they've existed since the Palestinians were displaced when the Jewish state was established. A great number of the people in Gaza are the refugees, their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. And the conditions are pretty bad. The unemployment rate is around 60% and poverty is rampant.
Okay, well, thank you. Okay, well, see you